Eggs play an important role in most sugar cookie recipes. They help bind the dough, add moisture, and contribute to the texture. But if you need to bake without eggs, finding the right substitute can be tricky. In this video, I've tested 8 common egg alternatives using the exact same sugar cookie recipe. Everything else stayed the same, just the egg was swapped out. We'll look at how each substitute works, how to use it in a standard recipe, and how it affects the dough and final cookies. Whether you're baking for allergies, dietary needs, or just experimenting, this should give you a clear idea of what to expect. Eggs might seem like a simple ingredient, but they do a lot of heavy lifting in sugar cookies. First, they add moisture to the dough, which helps keep the cookies soft rather than dry or crumbly. They also act as a binder, holding all the ingredients together for a dough that's easy to roll and cut. Beyond that, eggs contribute to the structure and texture of the final cookie. They help create that slightly chewy bite that many sugar cookies are known for, and they even affect how your cookies bake, from how much they spread to how golden they turn out in the oven. When you remove the egg, you're not just removing moisture, you're also losing some of that binding power, structure, and colour. That's why finding the right substitute isn't just about swapping one ingredient, it's about figuring out how to replicate all of those functions in a different way. To keep things fair, I used my standard sugar cookie recipe for every single batch. Same flour, butter, sugar, baking time. The only thing I changed was the egg. I also made a version of the original recipe with egg, so we'd have a positive control to compare everything against. That way, we're not just seeing how the substitutes perform in isolation, we're comparing them directly to the real deal. If you want the full recipe, I've linked it in the description. First up, I tested Mackenzie's Egg Replacer, a common go-to in Australia for vegan baking. It's a blend of starches designed to mimic eggs in texture and binding, but it doesn't add any flavour, colour or richness. To use it, you just mix 1 teaspoon of powder with 2 tablespoons of water to replace 1 egg. It's quick and convenient, especially if you keep a container in the pantry. It's often used in cakes and cookies where the egg isn't the star. So I was curious to see how it would handle something as simple as a sugar cookie. Next, I tried Greek yogurt. It's a bit unconventional, but it works surprisingly well in baking thanks to its moisture and protein. It helps bind ingredients and adds a bit of richness too. I replaced the egg 1-for-1 by weight with Chobani full-fat Greek yogurt. It's a great option if you've run out of eggs and have some yogurt in the fridge. It doesn't have the same elasticity as egg, so I was interested to see if it would hold the dough together or if it'd turn into a sticky mess. Cream cheese isn't the most common egg substitute, but it's surprisingly effective in some recipes. It's high in fat, with just enough protein to help bind the ingredients, and it brings a rich, smooth texture to the dough. For this test, I used Philadelphia cream cheese and swapped it in at the same weight as a standard egg. No prep needed, just weigh it out and mix it straight in. Because of its thickness, it works best when softened slightly so it blends evenly. Apple sauce is one of the most well-known egg substitutes in baking, especially in vegan recipes. It adds moisture and a bit of natural sweetness, but it doesn't offer much in terms of structure or binding. I used Coles applesauce and swapped it in by weight, same grams as the egg. No extra prep needed, just scoop and stir it into the dough like you would any other wet ingredient. I'm especially curious to see how this one bakes. Will it hold together or crumble? And will the apple flavour come through, or will it disappear in the final cookie? Next up, banana. This is a common go-to in vegan baking, especially for muffins and cakes. But I was curious how it would perform in a sugar cookie. I used the same method as the others, replacing the egg with the same weight of mashed banana. It adds moisture and natural sweetness, but it can also affect the colour and flavour quite a bit. It's not a neutral ingredient, so I'm expecting a softer cookie and definitely some fruity undertones. Still, if it holds the dough together and gives a good texture, it could be a handy option if you're in a pinch. Aquafaba is the liquid from a can of chickpeas, and it's become a bit of a baking secret weapon, especially in vegan recipes. It mimics the protein structure of egg whites and helps bind ingredients together. For this batch, I used 1.5 tablespoons of lightly beaten aquafaba to replace the egg. It has a slightly starchy texture, so I'm expecting it to hold the dough well without adding much flavour. It's a bit unconventional, but I'm really interested to see how it works in something like sugar cookies. Next up is cornstarch slurry, a simple mix of cornstarch and water that's often used as a thickener in cooking. For this test, I used 1 tablespoon of cornstarch mixed with 2 tablespoons of water to replace the egg. I expected this one to hold its shape quite well in the oven, since cornstarch can help firm up dough. But I was also curious to see if it would make the texture a bit gritty or chalky, given that we're adding more starch than usual. And finally, I made 1 batch without any egg or substitute at all, just to see how the dough holds up on its own. No binders, no moisture replacements, just the basic ingredients minus the egg. I was expecting this version to be a little drier and more crumbly, but it's also a good baseline to compare the others against. If the dough completely falls apart, that tells us just how important egg really is in this recipe. Alright, time for the fun part. How did they actually turn out? I baked each batch using the exact same method and compared them all side by side. We'll go through each one and look at the dough texture, how they baked, what they tasted like, and how they stacked up against the original egg version. That original version is what I'd call the gold standard in my kitchen. It's soft but holds its shape, has just the right amount of chew, a pale golden colour, and that classic buttery sugar cookie flavour. Some of these substitutes came surprisingly close, others not so much. Let's start with Mackenzie's egg replacer. This one surprised me. It was really easy to use and the dough felt just like the original. Once baked, the cookies looked totally normal. Same soft texture, same colour, and honestly, I couldn't taste a difference at all. The only thing I noticed? They spread more than most of the other batches, so if you're after sharper edges, you might want to chill the dough or tweak the ratio a little. I've also seen some people recommend prepping it in a specific way for better results, so your experience might vary depending on the method. Next up, Greek yogurt. This one worked way better than I expected. The texture stayed soft, the cookies held their shape really well with hardly any spread, and they baked up to the usual colour. I was kind of expecting a bit of tang in the flavour, but honestly I couldn't really taste it, so that was a nice surprise. And as for ease of use, just scoop, mix and go, super simple. Onto the cream cheese. The texture felt just a touch softer and maybe a bit fluffier than usual, but honestly, nothing too dramatic. It still held together really nicely. There was minimal spread during baking, and the colour came out pretty much spot on. Flavour-wise, it tasted just like a regular sugar cookie. No obvious cream cheese flavour coming through. The only thing to keep in mind is to let it soften a little before mixing it in, but otherwise, it was super straightforward to use. Now for the applesauce batch. The texture felt pretty standard, no weird chewiness or dryness, which was a good sign. That said, it was definitely one of the batches that spread the most during baking, so keep that in mind if you're aiming for sharp edges. Colour stayed nice and even, and while there might have been a faint apple note, it was really subtle. You could easily mask it with a little extra vanilla if you wanted. And as for sweetness, it didn't make the cookies any sweeter than usual. Super easy to use, just scoop straight from the jar. Let's talk about the banana batch. Texture-wise, it held up really well, maybe just a touch chewier than usual, but nothing off-putting. What really stood out was the spread, or lack of it. This one barely moved in the oven, making it the best performer in terms of holding its shape. The colour was a little darker than usual, which is pretty typical for banana in baked goods. As for the flavour, yep, it's banana. Definitely noticeable, so it's not the one to use if you're aiming for a neutral tasting cookie. Super easy to use though, just mash and mix. Next up is aquafaba, the liquid from canned chickpeas. I was actually surprised by how well this one performed. The texture of the cookies was basically identical to the original recipe, and it held its shape nicely in the oven with very minimal spread. The colour stayed the same and the flavour didn't change at all. As for ease of use, it was simple enough to measure and whisk up. The only catch? You'll need to find something to do with the rest of those chickpeas. Now for the cornstarch slurry. Honestly, this one surprised me. The texture was noticeably chalkier than the others, kind of brittle and a bit dry. Not awful, but definitely different. Oddly enough, it also had one of the biggest spreads during baking, which I didn't expect from a thickener. The colour looked normal, and the taste was fine, but you do have to get past that texture. On the plus side, It's super easy to use, and probably something most people already have in the pantry. Finally, the no egg batch. Just the original recipe minus the egg with no substitute added. As expected, it turned out drier and crisper than the others, leaning more towards a shortbread texture. Not bad at all, just different. There was a slight amount of spread, nothing too dramatic, and the colour and taste were pretty standard. It was also the easiest version to make, obviously. If you're after something more like a shortbread or you just ran out of eggs and want a cookie fix, this one works surprisingly well. So after testing all 8 substitutes, I've got to say, Greek yogurt, aquafaba and cream cheese were the standout performers. They kept the texture soft, had minimal spread, and didn't really mess with the taste or look of the cookies. Banana was actually a top contender too, especially for minimal spread, but it definitely brings that banana flavour with it, so it depends on whether that works with your recipe. Honestly, I was pretty impressed with how well most of these worked. If you're ever caught without eggs, or baking for someone with allergies or dietary preferences, there are definitely solid options out there. Let me know in the comments which one you're most curious to try, or if you've already got a favourite egg substitute that I should test in another round. And of course, if you found this helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe for more baking experiments and behind the scenes tests like this one.